Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Evolution has taught us that the overwhelming majority of species in the world have become extinct. There's no guarantee that this will not be as true of the human species as well. As Noam Chomsky puts it in his usual succinct way, there are two existential threats for our species' survival: nuclear war and environmental catastrophe. Denial of these facts and talking about the unspeakable still remain a problem for much of humankind. In order to transform these destructive alternatives, we need life-preserving, life-enhancing understandings rooted in radical love, healing, redemption, human rights, and equal justice for all. We need a life-affirming agape love, transpersonal, based on our common humanity, a universal concern with care and respect for all humans. That, in reality, is the only alternative to the destructive and self-destructive cycle of a fear-based worldview that continues to bedevil the human condition and threatens the extinction of the all. Our guests today on the Radical Imagination, through their writings, musical creativity, and artistic eloquence, help us deal with the unspeakable and unthinkable in ways that can transform our denials and destructive alternatives through the profound power of wordless music. Bruce Adolph is a prolific composer, well-known author, human rights activist, lecturer, and performer who spent a lifetime building community by exploring diverse manifestations of human creativity. Known to millions of Americans as the piano puzzler on American public media's performance today, Bruce is the author of The Sound of Human Rights, wordless music that speaks for humanity, a chapter in the Routledge Companion to Music and Human Rights. Julian Fifer is executive director of Musicians for Human Rights, a cellist and founder of the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. He's the senior editor of the just published Routledge Companion to Music and Human Rights, a widespread collection comprised of 28 chapters, interspersed with 23 voices from a variety of fields, including performing musicians. It's the first and definitive comprehensive examination of music and the field of human rights. Each voice focuses, through their intimate experiences with music, on how their work might defend or advance human rights. Their radical imagination seeks a role for human rights in music and a role for music in human rights. So thank you so very, very much for being here today. Bruce and Jeremy, it is a pleasure. It's an honor. This is an incredibly important book. I'd like to get started by you commenting on the planning for this, the thought that went out, that you were trying to grapple with to bring this book into fruition.
Well, it all started about 7 years ago, exactly, in March of 2015, when members of the Human Rights Orchestra and professors from the global campus of human rights in Venice got together to really develop a curriculum. We were interested in creating a curriculum at the intersection of music and human rights for high school students and university students. And we spent 5 days locked in a conference room on the Lido in Venice. It wasn't the most terrible place to be. And as we were concluding the last session, one of the participants suddenly interrupted us and said, "We're going about this backwards. We can't create a curriculum. We must do research and publish a book. And then out of that, we could perhaps try to develop a curriculum." So that was the beginning of it. And it's taken 7 years to reach this point of publication on May 31st, 2022. And we gathered, continued to gather people over a couple of years to discuss this. And it was only really about 4 years ago we put together a team of editors. I am not the senior editor, I'm the coordinating editor.
Sorry, Julian. Okay.
There are 5 equal editors. I don't want to get myself in trouble with my compatriot here. And one of the big challenges was how to organize this book, because too often music is thought as a salve, as through empathy, opening the way to human rights. And it still is the case, and it's an important part of what we talk about in the book. But as we've learned in recent decades, music has also been used to violate human rights, and very much so by the United States. And so we ultimately came up with 4 subject areas, general organizing principles. And one is fundamentals on music and human rights, and then music in pursuit of human rights, music in violation of human rights, and then what we see as intrinsic resonances between music and human rights. And that's where Bruce's extraordinary chapter resides. But as we were grappling with the contents and the contributors, the professors, the academics we were inviting to contribute chapters, I said that, this is terribly incomplete, because what about all of the musicians and administrators who are the music/human rights activists in the field? And as well, even in the academic world, ethnomusicologists now are really seeking to connect to lived experience and to help the people, the organizations that they're examining and researching or reporting on in the field. So we came up with the idea of including voices from different activists, and so 23 people have contributed a brief portrait of their work. So it is an unusual volume, and that's not strictly an academic volume of research, but also reflections and activities of current people, but not just current. 2 of them are people who've died, actually. So I'll stop there for the moment.
Interesting. Just to backtrack for a minute there. In reading some of the chapters, I know you mentioned political scientist, Professor Papiska, and he has developed the first academic human rights center in Europe. Were you influenced by his work?
Absolutely. And I was, yes, Antonio Papiska. And I was fortunate to have met him and worked with him and for about 2 years before he died. And he was an amateur violinist, and he felt that music and the arts really needed to be at the center of academic study and the development of the individual, because it encouraged reflection, self-reflection. It required connection to others, in whether it's in performance or working in an ensemble or developing the play or the dance you want to do, and it sort of compelled a sense of community. And so he really was this overriding spirit through the whole book to all of us. He was a great mentor to some of the editors and many of the contributors of the book.
Interesting. And so, Bruce, you wrote a chapter on human rights in music, and how nonverbal music can convey a persuasive social message and restore human dignity. You bring up that term over and over again. How did you come to write this piece, and why the stress on dignity? That term specifically.
If you're talking about my chapter,
yes, your chapter in the book.
Yeah, well, the chapter addresses the idea that wordless music can speak very clearly, maybe more clearly than words can, about the human condition. And the whole book, the not just my chapter, the whole book deals with dignity and uh, communication between people and empathy as a significant aspect of it. And what I decided to do was to trace this idea starting fairly far back with Mozart and Beethoven, and then move into the 20th century and then into the 21st century. And so it includes Mozart and Beethoven and Janacek, and then Shostakovich and Sofia Gubaidulina and Lei Liang, and Meredith Monk and Steve Reich and Wynton Marsalis and George Lewis and several other, I skipped a few people. But the idea is that in many ways, from different angles, wordless music, in other words, just pure music, can, through structure, through its the elements of music, can make a clear emotional narrative, and that emotional narrative can tell the story of struggle over adversity. It can tell stories of triumph over misery. It can give a sense of what grief and sorrow are, and move past it. So everyone understands this, and music that has a natural quality of bringing people together. But more specifically, for example, in the Beethoven, which is one of the best examples of how a piece of music can speak to human rights. In the slow movement of Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, the string section, which is the only part of the orchestra he uses for this movement,
The Fourth Piano Concerto.
In the Fourth Piano Concerto. Oh, did I say something else?
Okay. You said symphony.
Oh, sorry, Fourth Piano Concerto. Jump in and correct, because we're all making mistakes. That's normal. Okay, the Fourth Piano Concerto of Beethoven, the slow movement. The strings speak with this all in one voice, in unison, and it sounds very authoritarian. And the piano answers with this delicate, rich harmonic language that's very poetic and sensitive. And what happens in the course of this movement, I think it's unique up to that time. I know people have imitated this idea, but that the piano continues to be poetic and gentle, and it tames the orchestra. And the orchestra actually backs down dynamically. The phrases get shorter, and at the end, they almost come together. And it still ends with the piano being the most eloquent. But it could have been, and may have been, actually Beethoven writing about Orpheus taming the Furies. And no one knows for sure, but there is some evidence to suggest that. But that itself, of course, is a metaphor for real life and for speaking truth to power. So it is a perfect example. Everyone who hears that movement understands that the individual, the piano, is speaking to the large ensemble, the society, whether it's the society or authority itself, and has somehow convinced them through gentleness and poetry to back off from the violence that's inherent in the opening statement. And so it's an absolutely remarkable achievement. But all the pieces that I mentioned, and sometimes it's not a piece, but a particular body of work, such as with Meredith Monk, they bring something through music that is a deep message of humanity. I mean, Meredith Monk, for example, goes back to kind of pre-modern idea of music, although it is also very modern sensibility. And she deals with tribal feelings. It's mostly women's voices. There are no words spoken, just syllables. And so it's kind of pre-verbal, not only non-verbal, but pre-verbal sound that give us a feeling of very earthy, primal communication, using techniques, though, that have evolved in music over many years. So again, it's a sense of being anti-establishment is inherent in the music, that there's something sweet and gentle and empathetic and sympathetic that resides in the sound of the music itself, that breaks down walls, or as she has put it, melts walls. And so that's essentially the message of the chapter, that music can speak through narrative strategies, through structural ideas, and through the actual choice of notes and rhythms, which communicate very deeply to anyone who listens.
And the composer at times makes a conscious effort, has that in mind, an agenda, would you say, call it political, call it whatever, in the work? Are some more political than others?
Yes. I mean, I don't think it's always so clear to the composer who's thinking in music and thinking through music. It's not always a distinct decision that this is political. In fact, Sofia Gubaidulina says that her work is not political, it's spiritual, but the Soviet authorities thought of it as political because it broke down barriers and made people feel the need to connect with humanity in ways that they weren't allowed to. So in her case, it's a very good example, to answer your question, of someone who did not think strictly politically, but she did think about hatred and love. I mean, she said that hatred is a virus, which is interesting after a pandemic to think of that phrase, that hatred in the world is like a virus that spreads throughout humanity. And she was addressing that. And so it has political connotations because it depends on your frame of mind. I mean, everything can be seen as political. And so her addressing of her mission of spreading spirituality and love through music ended up being a political statement in the Soviet Union, and we can still hear it that way.
Right. And in your work piece, Julian, you make it very clear that music can be used in a variety of ways, in adverse ways as well, correct? So for one person to see it as some sort of liberation, spiritual, political, or whatever, the other person can use it for other sorts of purposes, correct?
That's right. But of course, it also relates to even listening to one piece of music that we might all love. We all have a different interpretation. We might have a different emotional response, a different understanding of it. And this is one of the important aspects as well, is to understand that we do each have a distinct viewpoint, and yet we're all responding to the same phenomena. And but yes, the music has been used through the centuries in violation of rights, and whether one wants to cite children's songs that were really for brainwashing purposes during in Japan during World War II, the use of music in Nazi Germany to really offend and people, up to the U.S. violation in the prisons, and the black prisons that we had around the world, and militaries, the British and the Israeli, it's in the book, did research on the use of music and sound as a means of torture dating back decades now.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that in the book, there are several chapters that deal with music and torture. Manfred Novak writes about it very powerfully. And he does talk about Chile and Pinochet, and Katja Stroke-Adolph does also address that exact issue of music being used. One very obvious way is playing music so loudly that you feel like your body is going to explode. I'm trying to paraphrase what Manfred Novak said. So loud that you can feel like you're going to go deaf or maybe even die from it. And then on top of that, you could be hooded and you have no idea where you are, and you could be starving. So that music, of course, that music was never meant to be used that way, but it obviously can be and has been. So people who do torture think of extraordinary ways to use things that were not meant to be that way. I just, as a parenthesis, this week's New Yorker has a very offensive, to me, offensive little comedy piece about someone who has great ideas for torture. And it's supposed to be funny how he thinks of, and he lists all kinds of stupid things that could be used to torture people as if that's his job. And he's obviously well off and safe and sipping drinks and going to lunch and thinking about torture techniques. And for some reason, this is in the New Yorker as a comedy piece. Anyway, for those of us who have been thinking about music as torture and reading in this book and knowing that it still exists, it's still going on, all kinds of torture.
Well, it's very active. Another example is a chapter in the book that's titled Music, Terror, and Civilizing Projects in China's Xinjiang Autonomous Region. And this is about the use of music to re-educate the Uyghurs and deny them their own culture. And whether it's in prayer, in dance, in ceremonies, they're not allowed to honor their own culture, and they're being forced to learn these Chinese songs and pay homage to the state. So it's a very active problem all around the world, actually.
But also, to put a little brighter tone on this, in Katya's piece, Weaponized Music, she does talk about Freudian therapeutic remembrance, in which we can overcome the compulsion to repeat and put the trauma behind us. So music can be used to heal. And that's a huge theme of this book, the need for that to happen, correct?
Yes, and there's a chapter on mental health and music therapy used to restore sense of identity and hope and resilience and be able to connect back to friends and community. So it is a central theme that informs the book. There's a very interesting chapter that's titled Girls Can Dance Zigubu Too. And it's about the use of a male warrior dance that's now been appropriated by young women and girls who were victims of sexual violence. And part of their restoration has been through song and dance, and taking this dance that was forbidden for women to participate in and perform it themselves as part of their coming out and also talking about what happened to them and seeking justice.
I think it's important to say that the book, I think, is overwhelmingly a positive take on music's role in human rights. But it wouldn't be a complete book if it didn't address how it's abused, of course. So that's where the torture comes in, which is quite astounding. But again, it speaks to the fact that the book really does cover an enormous amount of ground. Julian, it's like 25 authors and 23 portraits or voices.
There are 23 chapters and an epilogue and 23 portraits, what we're calling voices, and a total of 56 authors, contributors involved in writing those, because some of them are written jointly by two contributors.
Yeah, it is. It feels very. I hate to say complete because there's probably something missing, but it feels like it is, and it is an amazing guide to the concept of how music fits into society. Really, if you take human rights as a broad way of talking about humanity in general, so it's music and humanity. What does music do in society? How has it been used? How is it used now? All over the world, all different kinds of music. And its good uses, its abuses, its possibilities. And then, Julian, at the end of the book, you do something remarkable, I think, which is your discussion of the responsibilities or possible responsibilities of musicians now toward human rights.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. But before we get there, if we do, I do want to say...
We'll get there. I want to very much. Yes.
Is that for example, one of the chapters is about seeking environmental justice, and it's talking about the use of music and through also the practice of voodoo and voodoo spirituality to help replant a forest in Haiti. And it's the use of music as part of processes of justice in South Sudan, that music and orality is being used in the courtroom now and accepted as part of the process. There's an article chapter on the use of music to overcome homophobia in sub-Saharan Anglophone Africa, for example. So there are all these applications, and we try to cover a rather diverse representation. It's by no means thorough. It really can't be. And the more we studied, the more we read, the more we discovered how much more can be done in this field.
It's the first. So you're groundbreaking in your efforts here. But going back to the responsibility of musicians, and let's get. You feel like getting a little provocative here, or we deal with some provocative issues on this? I would like to ask you some questions on that.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I feel that we tend to separate our professional and personal lives. And we even often segregate our external personal life from our family personal life in different regards, how we relate to people. And I, in this chapter, really look at what are professional musicians doing? What benefits do they have because of human rights, such as freedom of expression and the right to privacy, which enables them to practice, and the right to enjoy and participate in culture. And do those rights that they have bear any obligations and responsibilities to help fulfill those of others, let alone to protect your own? And to what extent are there musicians around you who don't even have those? To what extent are women properly represented, proportionally represented in ensembles, orchestras, people of color, people of different nationalities? There's so much bias that and prejudice that pervades the professional music world. So in this chapter, I ask people to reflect on what's going on in their own conservatory, what's going on in their own orchestra, and also to consider what they're doing as an individual, even with where they bank, where they put their money, because at the same time that you can be doing a benefit concert to try to improve air quality or the life of people of indigenous tribes in the Amazon, you're putting your money in a bank that is funding the destruction of the forest or funding fossil fuel development. So you're undermining your own efforts and presumably your own value.
Yeah, their own values and freedom. And this becomes not only a political issue, a moral issue. And I certainly want to make this very clear that the influence of issues of power in the state and the militarism of the country and the imperialistic colonial nature of its history and so on, it is represented in all our major corporations and our cultural institutions. And let me just be very blunt about this. John Jay College, for example, the president has acknowledged and believes that they will take funding from the Koch brothers in the name of academic freedom. All kinds of institutions, I don't have to tell you, and medical facilities, other artistic cultural institutions are named after not only the Koch brothers, it's not. But let's get it very, very clear here. Koch, $65 million gift to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Even though Koch's politics may have entered the boardroom, his role in the arts was not without controversy. The renaming of the Met's Plaza after Koch prompted protests. Objections were made to Koch's seat on the board of the American Museum of Natural History, given his support for organizations that challenge climate change. One last thing on this, which I think needs to be pointed out, is his remark. I think it was David Koch. One reason is that he gave this money is that the left. He also certainly was interested in the arts. There's no question about that. We're not disagreeing with that. One reason is that the left-wing Democrats highly enjoy calling me an evil Koch brother, and the contributions I make in these many areas are tremendously worthy. It sends a message to the political groups in this country that don't like the conservative Republican businessmen. What sort of message does it serve when we're honoring and taking hundreds of millions of dollars from people who are advocating? It's very clear the science is pointing out that they're doing so much damage to the very world that we're seeking to heal and preserve. What should the role be then?
Yeah, well, I think
music and musicians.
With this book, we're really trying to focus on the individual and what every reader of the book can do as an individual, and whether it's an individual as part of a chorus, as part of a company where they work, as part of an orchestra and ensemble, what can they do to advance dignity and the human rights of people who are vulnerable? And but there is this constant challenge to ourselves, because you'll see that in the opening pages of the chapter on responsibilities of professional musicians, I suddenly question who gets to define who is professional. Is it based on degrees? Is it based on auditions? Are the standards the same in Western music as in other cultures? And what right do we even have to refer to ourselves? We're gatekeepers ourselves as professional musicians. And I use this acronym WEIRD, WEIRD, standing for white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So we have to constantly be looking at ourselves and what our own role is in perpetuating, at the same time that we're trying to change things. And yet, sorry.
I'm sorry. I'd like to add that in the last year and a half, or maybe 2 years since the pandemic first started, there's been, because of the pandemic and people being stuck at home and watching the world unfold, and the George Floyd tragedy and many others like it, there's been, at least ironically, in musical institutions, a sudden burst of awareness and an attempt to right wrongs. And it's just the beginning. But there is a huge movement of encouraging the employment, the hiring, and the collaborating with Black musicians, more women conductors, things like that. In fact, I was at the Met last night, and there was Breaks Progress was conducted by Susanna Melke. But there are, I could name maybe 20, for example, women conductors who are very active. And 2 years ago, I could name maybe 3. And they're being considered for all sorts of important positions. And there's also a new organization of Black orchestral musicians raising consciousness for orchestras to make an effort to take the qualified people who are everywhere out there, instead of just being happy with having a Black player in an orchestra and saying, look, we did something. And a lot of the major arts institutions are actively seeking to correct this. And I think that's an amazing beginning. And I'm very happy to see that it's happening. And
Yeah,
obviously,
it is rather
way to go.
recent, and I just would like to give a little quote from in the book. It's a quote of John Sloboda, who's a research professor at the Guildhall School of Music, because conservatories weren't really doing this. And at a meeting of conservatories in 2012 and 2013, he was really confronting them about do conservatories have any contributions to make to addressing the increasing polarization of modern society, increasing environmental and economic threats, and the breakdown of popular trust in the ability of politicians and corporations to work in our interests. And he stated, we in the music world need to have the confidence to assert that we are connected to the biggest questions that society faces and are capable of being agents of change. We must go beyond the comfort of an elite role or a historically justified sense of entitlement. Our existence is both a privilege and a responsibility. We should be providing resources to our students and to the wider society to understand what it is that makes a life well lived.
That's a great quote.
That is. Again, the society is grappling with such fundamental structural issues. Reverend Barber in the Poor People's Campaign, the interconnected issues of racism and poverty, excessive militarism, false political and religious narratives, and ecological devastation. I think in your book too, you touch on all of these issues in a very interesting and a very concise way as well. So I think you do a very valuable service to all us in that way. I also love, well, one of the quotes that struck me is very interesting that you put forward here. I think it was perhaps in your chapter, Julian, I'm not positive. Human rights also occupy non-binary space. They're indivisible and interdependent, interrelated. Competing and overlapping interests are present. And another point, you talk about no culture has ever existed without some sort of music, and even the struggle to gain empathy, to educate people toward greater levels of consciousness and empathy that you both have been talking about, exists in one's infancy. So I wonder if you could touch in all cultures. So I wonder if you could touch on some of those issues.
Well, some of this, yeah, I mean, there are many musicologists, ethnomusicologists talk about the presence of music in all cultures or all known cultures, and also there are philosophers such as Susan Langer who speak of music perhaps starting its life as a I don't know, I call it a stepchild or foster child of dance, first of all, and then of poetry to help the memorization and the ability to repeat. So it does seem to be universal. I don't like saying it's a universal language because we don't necessarily understand and have the reactions to music of different cultures as those cultures do, but it's universally present.
Right. You want to comment on that, Bruce?
Well, I'm glad you said that, Julian, about it being universally present, but not a universal language. I completely agree. But there was a Harvard study last year or the year before that said that they felt they had shown that it was a universal language, but they only concentrated on things like lullabies and wedding ceremonies, where, I mean, a lullaby, which may be made up or a very simple song that can seem similar in different cultures, often sung by a mother to an infant, is not all there is to music. So it could be that there are some roots, like there are in many shared languages, that are very similar and could speak to the concept of it being a universal language at its embryonic stage, that it's developed culturally in extremely different ways. And here I am, for example, I've studied music all my life, but I'm confronted with music of a culture I don't know, and I feel completely like not even an amateur, an outsider. I want to understand it more. And I've done things like work with musicians from other cultures occasionally and realize that even rhythm, I would have to start over learning how they think of rhythm. I got involved with some Indian rhythmic work a while ago, and it's fascinating and I loved it, but I couldn't, as a professional, as you say, professional Western musician, the rhythmic aspect that I was learning about Indian music made me feel like a beginner in understanding that language. So,
I had the same experience actually when Orpheus was on tour. We were in India in 1979, and we went to a performance of classical Indian dance, and there was a quartet of musicians, tabla and maybe sitar and voice. I forget what else was there, and their ensemble, their freedom, their flexibility, it's like they were much better than any string quartet I had ever heard in the history of music. It's like, oh my goodness. So I agree absolutely with what you're saying. I mean, talking about the rudiments, there was this very interesting study, I think from 2016, that came out of Harvard that did identify across cultures. But in a sense, you're talking about lullabies is, I think, exactly to the point, because Fernot, I think is her name, Fernald, and another uh, musicologist and psychologist, I can't recall right now, did studies that showed that there are very similar basic intonations across virtually all cultures when a parent is talking to an infant. That's either saying, wonderful, or stop, or
Yeah,
danger.
interesting.
And the shape of the contour of the sound is virtually identical across all of these cultures. So there are rudiments that are there.
also, I mean, I don't know if this has been proven, but certainly I've read that babies, when they first start making sounds, make sounds that can be related to cultures that are not their own. They make sounds that could say, oh, well, that could go into Chinese, or it could be Norwegian, or it sounds like Native American, and then it ends up they're speaking German or English or something eventually, because there's a certain amount of flexibility that's there. Julian, your comment about the ensemble is very interesting, because it made me think about notation in Western music, because traditional classical Indian music is not notated. And so what they learn, which is fascinating, is a great oral tradition full of there are ragas and there are rhythms that everyone knows, but within that there's tremendous improvisation and freedom, but not exactly like jazz. It's different. It's got its own world that I don't pretend to be an expert in. But because there's no notation, certain kinds of complexity don't seem complex. For example, if I'm improvising on the piano, I might do really crazy things. And when I sit down to notate that, I realize that notation is so complex that it will make everybody sit in terror of the notation. And then when someone learns the notation, they're playing it very accurately, but the sense of accuracy to the notation can overwhelm the musicality that was there at the improvisation. So there are aspects of complexity in notation that make it really hard to be as free and connected as when people are improvising off a basic system. And it's just fascinating, the different ways of relating to music. And that's one of the reasons I think that music and education should always include a kind of non-denominational, non-culturally specific sense of improvisation, something I'm a big proponent of, that improvisation can be done in any style or without a style. It can be just purely using notes and rhythms and your instrument to express ideas. And if that were part of education early on, it would be an amazing way of instilling empathy and sympathy and cooperation and a collaboration
Yeah.
in all
The
people.
issue of improvisation is also central to the chapter on music therapy, because indeed it's just the patient beginning to choose an instrument that's in the room and experiment with it, and then the therapist will maybe respond in some way, and they just create something together, being led by the patient.
Possibilities of healing and being able to make other choices in one's emotional state of being, correct?
Mhm.
In a sense, as you're talking, it also strikes me so clearly that what you're also exemplifying, both of you, and what you've been writing and discussing here today, is a way of loosening the grip of those authoritarian personalities that are so rigid and want to control so much the rest of us. And in saying that, if somehow we could use our radical imaginations, and you had a Donald Trump or a Putin or one of these authoritarian personalities, if you some way had 6 months to work with them, how would you create? How would you? What are some of the things you would try to encourage or have them listen to or work with, so that they could become less rigid and authoritarian?
I think it's too late with people of that
Really, no
age.
redemption, no.
No, I don't think it's possible. And that's why the education and starting really young is so important. Really have to infuse children with a world-centered notion. And in fact, that comes up in one of the chapters, that in education in parts of the West, we've moved from subject-centered to student-centered, and we become preoccupied with helping them express themselves and self-expression. But Geert Biesta says, but what if this self-expression is racist? What if it's oppressive? What if it's exclusionary? And so he sees the student-centered education as a way station toward world-centered, so that you're really thinking of your place in a much larger environment.
I think that's a profound point. We only have a minute or two, but that's a tremendously important point to in our discussion here today. Our moral identity is not that we are from just individual moral tribes. Yes, we are, but we need to build on this moral community of nations, of a universality of humanity, and religion, science, education, technology, capitalism, socialism has all failed us in various ways. So music can give us some hope toward this. Bruce, you want to have the last word on this, or?
Oh, well, what you were both saying reminds me that in the book, a very important aspect of it is the idea of thinking of oneself as a world citizen instead of an American or a German or a Japanese person, to think of yourself as a world citizen. And music actually does help that happen. I mean, as a musician, I know, and Julian knows, that when you meet musicians from anywhere in the world, even if it's not the kind of music you play, you share a sense of belonging to the world. You're a citizen of music, because it's a way of speaking and communicating that uses your body, it uses your intellect, it uses your emotions, it uses your small motor skills, your large motor skills, your memory. Everything is combined. Your whole brain is hooked up, and it's bigger than any country. It's bigger than any other kind of identity other than being a human, is to be a musician.
Yeah, I'd like to include here a quote by an educational theorist, Wayne Bowman, from a book, Artistic Citizenship. And it says, he wrote, "The arts are among the more important places where we develop character-rooted habits of ethical deliberation and learn their action implications, where we solidify the important connections between character and action, because artistic practices are deeply rooted or deeply concerned with right action in domains to which rigid rules and strict codes are unsuited, domains where predictability, consistency, and standardization are exceptions rather than the rule." It's sort of what Bruce was talking about before.
Yeah.
They are acutely reliant upon character-based guidance. They are among the more important places for developing patterns of action guided by concerns about how responsible agency relates to human thriving, to life well lived.
That's a great way to end this show. I still feel though, Julian, that if you both could have Donald Trump for 6 months and have him listen to Beethoven and Mozart, Shostakovich, and explain, and I think you can make some progress.
Jim, you really have a radical imagination.
And so do you. You both do. It's been an honor. I love you both so very, very much. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. We're over time as always, but thank you so very, very much. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Happy birthday. A day or two behind, but love and blessings to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it immensely. It was great.
It was wonderful, wonderful book. Thank you so very, very much, everyone. This is Jim Vrenos on The Radical Imagination. Thank you so very much for watching us today, and we'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.